This episode of Brief.IL is a unique one, as we indeed in very unique situations since Saturday, when American and Israeli forces launched a joint coordinated attack on Iran. As expected, Iran retaliated with missile and drone barrages targeting American military bases in the Middle East and Israeli population centers here in Israel. However, unlike the recent escalation in June last year, Iran also targeted a British military base in Cyprus, as well as military and civilian targets across the Gulf, from Qatar to the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. I am Ofir Dayan, a researcher at the INSS focusing on anti-Semitism and delegitimization, and in this special episode, I am joined by Dr. Raz Zimmt, the director of Iran and the Shiite Axis Research Program here at the INSS. Raz will brief us on the latest developments in the Iran-US-Israel escalation. In accordance with the IDF Home Front Command, we are recording this episode remotely. This is Brief.IL. Let's begin. Good morning, Raz.
Good morning, Ofir.
Okay, so let's start from the top. On Thursday, the American and Iranian teams, and it seems like a decade ago, they met in Geneva to negotiate on a possible deal about the Iranian nuclear weapons. A few days later, President Trump came out and said that he's very unhappy with how the Iranians are managing the negotiations. And then 2 days later, on Saturday, the US and Israel, in a coordinated attack, attacked Iran. So what went wrong in the negotiations? What are the issues that Iran was not willing to concede on?
Look, Ofir, even during the talks between Iran and the United States, between Foreign Minister Arakchi and Mr. Witkoff, it was very, very clear that it's going to be very difficult, almost impossible to bridge the gaps between Iran and the United States. It's not just the tactical differences between the US team and the Iranian team over several issues like whether or not to include the ballistic missiles within a possible arrangement between the two states, what to do about the right of Iran to enrich uranium, what to do with the fissile materials still left in Iran after the 12-day war. I think it was more than that. I think that the US perspective was that the Islamic Republic of Iran was at its and is still at its weakest point, perhaps since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and therefore it has to capitulate. You probably remember Witkoff interview giving a week ago, or I think it was a week ago, saying that President Trump was actually surprised with the fact that Iran did not capitulate. On the other hand, Iran and most importantly, Supreme Leader Khamenei had his own vision, saying, okay, if I have to choose between taking the risk of a military strike by the United States, which, with all due respect, is going to be very difficult for the Americans to topple the Iranian regime, or giving up Iran's entire ballistic and nuclear capabilities, I choose to take the risk. And at the end of the day, the talks collapsed. It was very obvious to the United States that there is no way to get any kind of agreement with this Iranian leadership. And that led to what we see in the last few days.
So we'll return to negotiations later in the podcast, but now that we understand why the attack is underway, let's briefly discuss the attack's motives or goals. And I think there's a confusion there because I hear many people saying, at least to me, the Israelis and the Americans they aim to topple the Iranian regimes, but on the other hand, the Americans and Israelis said many times that this is not the goal. And at the same time, some politicians on the American and the Israeli sides are making some statements that might be interpreted as trying to topple the regime. So what are the goals of this attack? What is Israel trying to achieve? Maybe what the US is trying to achieve?
So first of all, I have to admit that I'm also confused with the different and contradictory statements made by different American officials and also Israelis. I would say that obvious military goals, so to speak, goes back again to trying to degrade as much as possible Iran's strategic capabilities. I think that this time, unlike the 12-day war in June, the most important priority would be to degrade Iran's ballistic missiles. We all remember that during the war, Israel managed to hit both many launchers used to launch missiles at Israel, but also to block the entrances to those underground compounds used by Iran to store the ballistic missiles. But at the end of the day, very shortly after the war, we know that Iran was trying quite successfully, I would say, to reconstitute the ballistic missiles. So I certainly think and hope that this time much efforts are going to be put, mostly perhaps by the US, in order to make sure that it's not just the launchers which are being hit, but also the underground capabilities and perhaps the production lines of missiles, to make it more difficult for Iran to reconstitute their ballistic missiles. The second so-called military goal is to deal with the remains of the nuclear facilities in Iran. Here, on the one side, one can say that there has not been a very significant progress made in Iran's nuclear program since the 12-day war, but some construction working, some efforts have been made by Iran to reconstitute at least several sites, and this since yesterday has become another objective of the Israeli-American campaign. The more difficult and complicated objective relates to the issue of the stability of the regime. I personally believe that both the US and Israel realize very clearly that it's impossible to topple the Iranian regime or any kind of regime just through aerial strikes, as significant as they are. But what perhaps could be achieved is to pave the way to get the conditions ready. So if the Iranian regime is undermined, is weakened for a long period of time, this could perhaps pave the way for encouraging the Iranian people to go back to the streets at some point, and that might allow a more significant political transition inside Iran. But again, it's very difficult to say whether the US will be satisfied with some kind of a change from within the regime, meaning perhaps
like we see in Venezuela.
Exactly, perhaps a more pragmatic element within the Iranian political and security elite taking control, or that the ultimate goal is still regime change, but that has to be depends not just on weakening the Iranian regime, not just targeting, as we saw in recent days, IRGC, meaning Revolutionary Guards, Basij, law enforcement forces, bases, and headquarters all over Iran, but it has to meet the readiness and the capability by the Iranian people, again, to go to the streets and perhaps use the weakening Iranian regime in order to rise up.
And I think both the US and Israel understand that, because we hear in both President Trump's statements and Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement that they're calling on the Iranian people to go out of to the street and reclaim their country. But I want to touch on something that you briefly talked about. What are the Iranian capabilities going into this round of escalation? What are we trying to attack? What are the capabilities that they do have right now in terms of missiles, nuclear program, etc.?
So the most important kind of targets which could perhaps pave the way for a more significant weakening of the Iranian regime is by targeting the suppressive security forces, elements, and assets all around Iran. As I mentioned before, Basij, police, IRGC headquarters all over Iran. But that by itself is certainly not enough. I mean, first of all, as long as the war continues, I find it very difficult to believe that hundreds of thousands, certainly millions of Iranians are going to go back to the streets, risking their lives, not just facing the Iranian brutal suppressive elements, but also the missiles and jets surrounding all over Iran. The question is whether all those efforts by the Israelis and the Americans, not just to decapitate officials within the security establishment in Iran, and not just the IRGC. We also had reports about the decapitation of the Ministry of Intelligence gathering in the first day of the war. If those efforts meet at some point regathering of millions of Iranians in the streets, which again, I don't think it will happen as long as the war continues, that might perhaps change the balance of power between the regime, its supporters, its security elements, and the anti-regime or the protest movement. But again, while you can certainly control what you do on the ground when it comes to decapitation efforts or targeting assets of the regime, you can't really control the Iranian people and their ability to go back to the streets.
And now let's turn to the other side of this escalation, Iran, obviously. So the Iranian retaliation soon arrived, and it included, last time we saw strikes against American military assets in the Middle East. We saw targeting of Israeli military and civilian targets here in Israel. But this time we see a broadening of the scope. So they're attacking countries in the Gulf, from Doha, Qatar to Oman, who was one of the negotiating teams in the negotiations with the United States. It was the mediator. And we see strikes in Saudi Arabia, just like last night in the American embassy. And we even see strikes in Cyprus on British bases. What is Iran trying to say, or what is the message that Iran is trying to convey by broadening the scope of the attacks?
Phil, that goes back to the main difference, I think, between the 12-day war in June and what's going on in the last few days. After the 12-day war, one of the narratives adopted by the Iranian regime and the Iranian officials was that the campaign by Israel and the United States back in June was not aimed just to degrade Iran's ballistic and nuclear capabilities, but also to change the Islamic regime. Now I think they realize that this time this might be indeed the objective of both the United States and Iran. So from the Iranian perspective, this is a war of survival. They certainly consider the US and Israeli attacks as an existential threat to the stability of the regime. And therefore, they are using whatever means they can in order to make sure that this war will end as soon as possible before it imposes a real threat to the stability and the existence of the Islamic Republic. Now, we don't have to be surprised, because even before the war, Iranian officials, both military officials and political officials, including Supreme Leader Khamenei, said very bluntly and very clearly, this war is going to turn into a regional war. It was Khamenei who said that a few weeks ago. And so when the war started, and as they considered that as a war intended to put the existence of the Islamic regime in stake, they will use whatever means in order to escalate things, in order to inflict damage, not just to Israel and the US forces in the region, but also on the Gulf states, on UK bases in Cyprus, in order perhaps to impose more pressure by those countries on President Trump to keep this war as short as possible before it evolves into an existential threat to the stability of the regime. And another mean to do that, by the way, is what they didn't do in June, and that's to expand the war to Iran's proxies and allies in the region as well.
Okay, so what I find interesting personally is that until now, even when the rhetoric escalated, they still left a path open to negotiate or to solve things diplomatically with the Gulf states. But it seems that this time they are directly attacking Gulf states. Did Iran completely give up on diplomacy with those states, or what is happening behind the scenes?
When you follow Foreign Minister Arakchi's statements and phone talks with some of his counterparts in the Gulf, you can't be you cannot be not amused by that. He says we have no bad intentions towards our neighbors in the Arab states in the Gulf. but simultaneously, the Revolutionary Guards keep targeting not just the U.S. targets in those countries, but also civilian targets in those countries.
We saw the Dubai airport and hotel.
Exactly, and that reminds me when Hassan Rouhani was the president of Iran, he used to say, and also his foreign minister Mohammad Javad Zarif used to say that in Iran there is a distinction between the diplomacy and the field, the war field, and he meant by that is that while the foreign ministry and perhaps even the president are engaged in diplomatic and political efforts to reduce tensions in the region and to improve relations with its neighbors, the Revolutionary Guards act on a different path, sometimes trying to escalate things. Now, under Khamenei, it was very clear that there was at least someone who would make the decisions at the end of the day. And I think that even today, you can see simultaneously the foreign ministry is trying to, I wouldn't say to de-escalate, because there is no way to de-escalate when Iranians are still launching missiles at their neighbors, but perhaps to keep some kind of horizon or possible horizon for de-escalation and perhaps improving ties with its Arab neighbors at the day after the war.
I think some of their Arab neighbors would beg to differ and would think that diplomacy and attacks would not go together. But we promised to go back to negotiations. So let's go there for a second. On Sunday evening, Israel time, President Trump said Iranian leaders approached him and told him they're willing to negotiate. But on Monday, Iranian officials came out and contradicted Trump's claim. Is Iran willing to negotiate? And if not, which condition would push it towards negotiation?
Look, it's very clear that only a few days after the elimination of Supreme Leader Khamenei, there is no tendency in Tehran, at least in public, to show some kind of willingness to negotiate with the Americans. It's very clear that they want to,
because that would make them seem weak, or is there
exactly because they are not in a position to show any kind of weakness, and they want to maintain this resistance tone adopted by Supreme Leader Khamenei. But my assessment is that if at some point Trump is going to say, okay, you know what, I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. Hopefully it will take rather weeks than days, because I don't think it's possible to achieve the objectives of the war within a couple of days. But when that comes and the United States approaches Iran very seriously and say, okay, enough is enough, let's stop the war, I find it very difficult to believe that Iran will continue with this war. Again, it goes back to what I say, because they really think that this is an existential war, and they would probably prefer to put an end to that as soon as possible.
Like President Trump said to President Zelensky, they just don't have the cards. And I think that at this point, they're playing like they do have the cards in their hands. But let's say negotiations do take place sometime in the future. What are red lines that Iran is not willing to cross in negotiating with the Americans? And do they meet the bare minimum the US is willing to accept?
You know, unfortunately, I have to say that I don't see any real chance that Iran is going to give up the red lines which were adopted by Supreme Leader Khamenei. I mean, it will really take a very significant political transition in Iran in order to allow the new Iranian leadership to adopt a more pragmatic, conciliatory approach. I mean, if we look today at the current Iranian leadership, Supreme Leader Khamenei is gone. It's probably a matter of days until the Assembly of Experts is going to pick up his successor, probably from among the high-ranking Iranian clerics inside Iran. In addition to the Supreme Leader, we still have, in the political level, the Secretary of the SNSC, the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, Ali Larijani, who seems to me today as the number one actually ruling Iran and making the most decisions, at least when it comes to the political decisions. He might be assisted also by the Speaker of the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf. But if you look at the military elite, the chief of staff was killed as well, Mousavi. He was replaced. We still don't know by whom. The new commander of the Revolutionary Guards, following the assassination of Pakpur, is Ahmed Vahidi. Ahmed Vahidi is one of the most hardliner, extreme, radical elements within the Revolutionary Guards. He was actually the commander of the Quds Force many years ago, involved in the terror attack carried out by Iran against the Jewish community building Amia in Buenos Aires. So as long as this kind of leadership is intact, I find it quite difficult to believe that we will see a major strategic transition in Iran. And that means that no leadership, at least for now, will be able to give up its strategic elements, its the missiles, the missiles capacities, its regional aspiration. So the only scenario in which I think that we might see some change is if we see an Iranian leadership more pragmatic, which is ready not perhaps to give up the entire strategic goals of Iran, but perhaps to prioritize the domestic problems and crises inside Iran over, for example, giving further support to its allies and proxies in the region. But it's still early to assess whether we will see such a more pragmatic leadership in Iran.
But I think the proxies in the region are maybe the third priority after the ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons. So how does something like that happen? The scenario that you described of prioritizing domestic issues. What does that mean for actually conceding?
That means that, after the 12-day war, there was a debate going on inside Iran between the more pragmatic elements, for example, President Pezeshkian, former President Hassan Rouhani, who is, of course, not involved currently in decision-making in Iran, who said, we don't have to give up our strategic goals, but we certainly have to prioritize and focus on trying to solve the domestic problems inside Iran, the economic crisis, the shortages of water and electricity. And if that means putting less money to supporting, for example, Hezbollah, we know that since the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in November 2024, Iran has already delivered a $1 billion support to Hezbollah. So that was one approach. The second approach, which was adopted at the end of the day by the Iranian leadership, led by Khamenei, was that while some adaptations might be taken, Iran should not give up its so-called resistance path when it comes to supporting its proxies and continue to reconstitute its strategic allies. If this debate resumes after the war, and if we have a different kind of Iranian leadership, mostly consisted with not liberal, secular, pro-Western elements, because this is not going to happen, but with more pragmatic elements, which might be less obsessed, I would say, with the revolutionary ideology, as Supreme Leader Khamenei was, then perhaps we might see some changes which could allow perhaps negotiation with the United States with different conditions or circumstances.
So you mentioned Hezbollah. In the round of escalation last June, Hezbollah stayed out of the conflict. And this time, they symbolically joined last night with a few missiles, but that's it. How do you see Iran's ability to harness its proxies to join this war? Because so far it hasn't happened on a large scale.
Well, Hezbollah had two very bad options on the table. it could either do nothing, but that would show its weakness, especially after Naim Qassem, Secretary General of Hezbollah, made it very clear before the war that in case of the elimination of Supreme Leader Khamenei, this would be considered as a red line by the organization. The other option on the table was to join the war against Iran, even in a more symbolic way, but taking the risk of engaging Hezbollah in another confrontation against the IDF and against Israel. And at the end of the day, he couldn't resist. He couldn't resist both I would say the resistance component of the Hezbollah DNA and his commitment to Iran, which certainly plays a major role in managing the daily decision-making in Hezbollah, certainly after the defeat of Hezbollah in the summer of 2024. There was also increasing pressure from within I would say ideologically support base of Hezbollah within the Shiite community inside Lebanon to do something, and he made a decision. Now, from the Iranian point of view, as I said before, this is an existential threat. This is a battle for its survival, and therefore it put a lot of efforts into trying to mobilize its allies in the region, certainly the most committed one, like Hezbollah, like some of the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, in order to be mobilized for this. And we also have to take into consideration, of course, the fact that the members of the so-called Axis of Resistance realized that if this regime collapses, it's going to be a major loss, not just for the Islamic Republic, but to the policy supporting its allies and proxies in the region.
So do you think Iran is satisfied about what happened so far? Because surprisingly, the Houthis didn't do much, the Iraqis also, and Hezbollah, again, just one time. Do you think it's enough for Iran, or are we expected to see Iran pressuring them to do more?
So first of all, we still don't know if that's the end of that. We might see more steps forward to escalate things even further. Through the Houthis, through the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. But I think that at the end of the day, Iran realized very clearly the constraints posed by their allies in the region. They know exactly what are the capabilities and constraints on Hezbollah. They know that the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq are currently most interested in the process of forming a new government in Iraq. The Houthis, with all due respect, were never that disciplined, despite the growing cooperation between Iran and the Houthis over the last decade. So even if they really want those elements to escalate things even further, I think they also realize the fact that the axis of resistance and the pro-Iranian axis in the region has been very much weakened over the last 2.5 years.
Right. And perhaps the most strategic development in the last few days was the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. We see that Iran keeps functioning following this elimination, but what does the elimination mean for Iran's ability to continue waging this war and about its decision-making that we can expect in the next few days or weeks?
So on the one side, I would say that the death of Ayatollah Khamenei is certainly an end of an era. I usually considered Khamenei and described him as the last Iranian revolutionary. And I think that his death, certainly under those circumstances, paved the way for a major political transition in Iran. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead to some kind of regime change, but things are not going to be the same. I mean, it's very clear that the next supreme leader is going to be much weaker because any kind of new leader will be very difficult for him to step into his shoes after 37 years in office. And it might also result in some kind of battle between different factions within the Iranian elite, both the security elite and political elite, And I think that it's more important to see not just who is going to be the next supreme leader of Iran, but what role will be played by the different centers of powers inside Iran. For example, the clerical establishment in Iran, certainly the Revolutionary Guards, the SNSC. But having said that, I have to make it very clear that Iran is a very much institutionalized, organized state. It was created in a way which make it very much resilient. It's not just the supreme leader. It's a whole bureaucratic, clerical establishment. Just to give one example, Iran's Supreme Leader office consists of thousands of employees. He has a network of tens and hundreds of thousands of employees in different parts of Iran. The security forces in Iran consisted of the IRGC, the Basij, the law enforcement forces also consist of hundreds of thousands of employees. It's not just the military issue. We know that the IRGC controls a major part of Iran's economy. So you have a huge deep state in Iran which still functions. And therefore, even
and loyal to Khamenei after his death.
Exactly. There are no orders from Khamenei, but they are totally independent in a way. And so if there is a new supreme leader, and there is going to be a new supreme leader, and if the elite can maintain itself, I would say that the deep state can certainly survive and can certainly function. So it will take, it will be very, very difficult to move from the stage of targeting or decapitation of the supreme leader and perhaps several other officials in Iran to breaking out, or I would say diffusing this huge state apparatus and system which has survived for 47 years.
So let's talk about this potential next supreme leader. There are many names being thrown around in the last 2 days. Who are some of the people we should already closely follow as possible successors to Khamenei? And besides that, who are possible people that we need to follow who will gain power without being elected as the successors to Khamenei?
Yeah, so for several years there were three theses dominating the discourse about who is going to replace Khamenei. One, until his death in 2024, was former President Raisi, Ebrahim Raisi. Actually, there was almost a consensus that the fact that he was able to become president by disqualifying all other alternatives in the presidential election meant to pave the way for his becoming the next supreme leader of Iran. But unfortunately for him, it didn't materialize after his death in the crash of his helicopter in 2024. And then there were other two options on the table. One, the possibility that Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, might replace him as a successor. I have to say that for many years I didn't really take that very much seriously, because it would be a major change from the political theory of the Islamic Republic, which was actually against the hereditary transition of power after the Shah. So I still believe that it's not very likely to see a scenario in which Mujtaba will become the supreme leader. I think it will also make it even more difficult to get over this legitimacy crisis suffered by the Islamic Republic. So I think that the more likely scenario would be that the Assembly of Experts will convene and will just nominate one of the high-ranking clerics as the next supreme leader. I think that we have to follow one in particular, and that's Ayatollah Ali Reza al-Rafi. If you don't know his name, that's okay. I think that the majority of Perhaps even the Iranians don't really know him, but he's a high-ranking Iranian official. He was the director of the religious seminaries in Iran for many years. He was also the president of Mustafa University, which is a university dealing with recruiting clerics and students from all over Iran, from all over the world, bringing them to Iran and learn Islamic law. He is also a member of the Guardian Council, and what perhaps is more important, that he was actually elected as the representative of the Guardian Council in this trio temporary leadership council, which, according to Article 108 and 11 in Iranian Constitution, has to manage state affairs after the death of a supreme leader and until a new leader is selected. So today we have this trio consisted of the president, Pezeshkian, the head of the Iranian judiciary, Mohseni Ejai, and Ayatollah Rafi, who was nominated as the number 3. So I would follow him very closely. Now, the second part of your question, I think that we have to follow mostly Ali Larijani, the Speaker of the Majlis, Ghalibaf, and the top generals within the IRGC and the security forces. They might certainly use this opportunity, especially if someone like Rafi is appointed, because Rafi has quite limited experience in managing the daily affairs of a state. So if we find ourselves in a situation of quite a weak supreme leader, it might be used by other elements from within the elite inside Iran to make sure that they play a more significant role in managing the decision-making process inside Iran.
So I think many of our listeners are only interested in one question, or mostly interested in one question. What are the chances the elimination of Khamenei and this escalation starts a snowball that ends up with the collapse of the regime? And I heard you say on many occasions that we shouldn't assume that's the most probable result. But what do you think are the conditions that will lead to such a result, and how can Israel and the United States intervene, assuming that they would like to see the regime collapse?
So, with all respect to what Israel and the United States can do, and they can do a lot, mostly militarily, but perhaps some efforts can be made in order to encourage the resumption of protests in Iran. For example, there was a report yesterday that Israel was attacking in the western part of Iran near the border of Iraq in an attempt to weaken the security forces deployed there, and that might assist the Kurdish separatist elements working there against the regime to become even stronger. That could be done. But at the end of the day, you really don't have any control on millions of Iranian citizens deciding whether to go back and risk their lives against the regime. Because, even when this war is going to be over, if there is still significant presence of the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij and the police, and if we will not see significant fractions and divisions and defections from those forces, which we haven't seen until now, although there were some reports about hundreds, perhaps, of low-ranking.
President Trump amplified.
Yeah, and perhaps he's right. Perhaps there are several hundreds of IRGC or law enforcement forces who are ready to defect. But I think that at the end of the day, they know the risk of doing that, because nobody can give them guarantee that if this Islamic regime collapse, they will be spared by the new government, by the new leadership. Just let me give you one example. If you are a member of the Basij or the Revolutionary Guard, and you live in a certain neighborhood in the northern part of Tehran, and everyone knows where you live, and everyone is familiar with what you did just a few weeks ago to brutally suppress your people, I'm not sure that his life is and his family's life is going to be spared by
even if the United States decides to give him immunity.
Exactly, by the angry Iranians who will come after you. And so at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, in order to see a regime change in Iran, a revolutionary regime change in Iran, there has to be a change in this equilibrium or this balance of power between the regime, its security suppressive apparatus, and the protest movement. And we will never be able to know what exactly will encourage millions of Iranians to go back to the streets.
So I want to conclude by one question. How long can this keep going? How long can Iran keep waging this war? And how long do you assume that the United States and Israel would like to maintain this situation?
So it goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of our talk. It's very difficult to know that because we don't really know what are the strategic objectives of Israel and the United States. I mean, if it comes only to the military objectives, the degradation of Iran's ballistic missiles and some of the nuclear facilities, we can certainly do that in a matter of a few more days or a few more weeks. But if the objective is to create the conditions to some kind of undermining the Iranian regime, that might take much longer because you can have different definitions of what those conditions are. Iran is a state at the size of Western Europe, more than 90 million people. You will always have targets to hit. I mean, we managed to wage a war in Gaza for more than 2 years, and there are still targets.
Not to mention the Iranian wars, the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Exactly, and so my sense is that in a matter of a few weeks, someone, most importantly, President Trump, will have to make a decision to stop the war. And then, of course, the question remains whether we are going to be in a much better position, both strategically and militarily, because it's unthinkable that we will have to wage a war against Iran every 8 months or once a year. That's that we cannot tolerate that. But we also know, following the 12-day war, that unless there is some kind of political transition in Iran, not necessarily a total regime change, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that Iran is incapable of rebuilding and reconstituting its capabilities. So I certainly hope that in a matter of few weeks, at least the Iranian regime will be in such a bad situation, which might encourage some kind of adaptation in Iran's policy and strategy, but it really depends on what we will see in the upcoming days and weeks.
Dr. Raz Zimmt, thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you, Ofir.
And that's it for this episode. This was Brief.IL by INSS, a weekly dive into the events shaping Israel's national security. We warmly invite you to follow us on any podcast platform of your choice, and you can also watch us on YouTube and on the INSS channel. And of course, stay safe wherever you are. Thank you to the amazing team Ariel Nogrian, Shai Shachaf, and Omer Vixelbaum.